I want to start off, if I can, really, just to introduce the Wildlife Trust to you. I'm sure pretty much everyone in this room will think you know the Wildlife Trusts, but whenever I do this, it sort of surprises some people when I share a few facts and stats about us. So we are a federation of 46 locally run independent wildlife trusts, our own organisations, own chief execs, own trustees for the individual trusts. But together we work as a federation, 46 trusts and then the central charity as well. And people will know their individual local trust as a small, medium-priced organisation. But of course, when you add it together, we've got real scale. So if I tell you that we've got more nature reserves, say the McDonald's has got restaurants in the UK, in fact, 1,000 more, collectively we're the 7th largest landowner in the UK. We now have, our collective income last year was over 300 million and we've now got over 4,000 staff. So actually we're huge in scale when you kind of add it together. And that's a huge amount of evidence that we've been collecting across the Wildlife Trusts over decades. And we would say that we've been using evidence to shape our thinking for decades at the Wildlife Trusts. Of course, many organisations do. But have we really? To what extent? And actually, could we be doing it better? And that's one of the things that we're going to get into in this. And in that, I know that one of the things you've been talking about this morning is what's often said is that we need in the conservation sector to use evidence much more, in a much more comprehensive way to shape our thinking, to help make our decision making, to find out which practices work and which don't, for funders, for stories and so on. That's all a given. But the other thing I want to add in is we also need it to shape our politics. Because let's be clear, over the last few years, I would argue that particularly around nature, we've not seen nearly as much use of evidence in our politics that we need to. We've seen increasingly in an age of populism, we're seeing more and more assertions being made, more and more narratives being made in our politics that actually aren't backed up by evidence at all. And I think we in the conservation sector have to an extent, take that on the chin and think, what do we need to do differently to make sure that our political debates are informed by much better evidence and that we can push evidence in narratives that help shape the politics in the future. And this is in a context where, of course, our politics is ever more chaotic and confusing, and we have to be able to move fast. So it's no good us coming out 3 years after a big political debate has happened with the evidence to show that something was wrong. We have to be able to move really fast in this. To give you some reminders of the kind of things that perhaps I might be referring to here, let's start with this. I mean, if you were to listen to things that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have said over the last 18 months, anyone would believe that the whole reason that our economy in the UK has been struggling in recent years is all down to bats and newts and perhaps a jumping spider or two. Now, I've said all this publicly before now. Of course, what they're doing now, I would say, is scapegoating nature. And I would say, because they're not being brave enough to talk about the real reasons the economy's been struggling in this country the last few years. I can think of one beginning with B, but we'll move on from that. And I don't mean bats. It's been very convenient to scapegoat nature and blame poor old bats and newts and jumping spiders instead. But is it backed up by the evidence? Well, and of course, again, if you hear it, you'd suggest that it's bats and newts, the whole reason we can't build any houses in this country, is what the political debate would say. But actually, you look at the evidence. Here's a piece of work that we commissioned, looking at every planning appeal in England in 2024. And guess what? Bats and newts were mentioned in just 3% of them. So 97% of planning appeals in 2024 did not mention bats and newts at all. So in other words, all this political debate is about 3% of the planning appeals and ignoring the other, the 97%. So what can we do as a sector to make sure that ahead of the game, before these things rise up, actually we're putting the evidence on the table, and not just putting the evidence on the table, but turning those into narratives that deliver impact and change the story that shapes our politics around nature. Give another example about HS2. Let's just be honest, I think HS2 has been a very difficult issue for the conservation sector. You know, broadly, high-speed rail is better than flying and all of those kind of things. But I think what we've ended up with HS2 is a railway line done wrong. And I don't think the evidence was necessarily there for how it ended up being done. And of course, in there is the famous so-called bat tunnel, which has provoked a lot of interest as well. And a lot of assertions made in our political debate around the bat tunnel that were completely wrong. For a start, it's not a tunnel for bats, it's a tunnel for trains, of course, even though everyone calls it a bat tunnel. And I would say the reason we ended up with things like the bat tunnel, which bear in mind, Natural England never required HS2 to build a bat tunnel. It wasn't Natural England's idea, it was HS2's idea. And they came up with, I would say, an engineering solution for an ecological problem. And if they'd thought, if HS2 Limited had properly looked at the evidence and properly thought about how to integrate nature in the design and planning of HS2 early on, you wouldn't have needed a bat tunnel. You would have had a very different answer to the problem. But the evidence wasn't used and given enough weight early on in the process. And so we ended up with this debate that we've had around a bat tunnel and so on. Let's take another example. I know Lynn's here, one close to Lynn Dix's heart, of course. But, you know, the evidence has been really clear for many years about the harm that neonicotinoid pesticides cause to bee populations. And the evidence has been really, really clear. And yet that was completely ignored, of course, in 2021 by the government. And for several years, when they tried to put derogations in place to say that actually the bans on neonicotinoid pesticides could be, don't have to be upheld for a period of time. The fact that the evidence was so strong enabled us as the Wildlife Trust to bring a legal challenge, which meant the government in the end backed down. But it just shows the importance of evidence in trying to shape this politics. And the more that we can get out in front of this, and I think we can do a better job in the years ahead, ourselves as a Wildlife Trust, but the whole conservation sector, we've got to be one step ahead of this and stop these ridiculous narratives developing. And then to give one more to remind you, if you think back to the general election in 2019, of course, we had a moment there where I think the conservation sector have already done a good job in talking about how actually there is a role that nature can play in helping tackle climate change. And there are nature-based solutions. And actually, for example, increasing the number of trees would not be a bad thing. But then that sort of spun out of control into a political debate that led to all the political parties competing in the run-up to the 2019 election with these ridiculous numbers about how many trees they wanted to plant, with, if you remember it, no suggestion at all about any role of natural regeneration or anything like that. There was no discussion about actually how much woodland habitat we want to create. It was just how many bits of plastic we can bang in the ground, as far as I could remember. So we've got to do a much better job at trying to shape these narratives in advance. And I suppose one of the things I'm saying is, how can we use evidence to create a kind of good populism for nature, but a form of populism that actually is based on solid evidence and reason, and not the nonsense that too often we see. Now, Wildlife Trust has been very proud to be involved in Bill Sutherland's group, and many of you in this room, in thinking about some of this and producing a vision for future conservation evidence in the conservation sector. And as a result of being involved in that paper, we then produced our own internal framework across the whole of the Wildlife Trusts, a collective framework for data, research and evidence in the Wildlife Trusts, particularly in a digital age when the opportunity is across our 46 trusts. If we can collect evidence and collect data in a coherent and coordinated way, of course that starts to lend itself to ability to produce big data sets and do all the kinds of things that then result of that. But not if 46 trusts are doing it differently. Then it's not going to be able to do that. So having a common framework around how we go about this is hugely important. And this was finally agreed right across the Wildlife Trust movement in March 2024. We want to be, as the Wildlife Trusts, we want to be, and to be seen to be, a federation that is evidence-led and solution-focused. So that's why we're working so hard together across the whole movement and with many other partners to deliver easier access to more, better quality and more useful and data and evidence. And this will mean it will help everyone take meaningful and effective action so that we can achieve more for the recovery of nature and a stable climate and benefit society. And three key things that we've said that we want to be able to do by 2030. And all of them, none of this is rocket science, but actually being really focused on making sure we do it will be important. Number one, we want to make sure we're having a real impact on the natural world. And that would be nice. Real impact on the natural world and people's relationship to it. And we want the evidence to absolutely prove it. We feel really confident we've done a good job of that over 100 years. I don't want you to misunderstand me. But actually having the real solid evidence to prove it, which I think will be hugely important. We want by 2030 be absolutely clear and to be able to demonstrate that our decisions, our actions, our solutions are being informed by the best available data and evidence. We all know across the conservation sector, particularly say on the management of reserves, often we fall into the trap of doing something because we've always done it, rather than whether we've really solidly got the evidence to say it's the best thing to do for nature. So we want to drive a culture shift in that regard. And we want to be able to demonstrate by 2030 that our knowledge and experience are creating good new data and evidence as a matter of course. So actually the next step of that, and we've done this just last autumn, is set up what we call the Evidence Emergency Project right across the Wildlife Trust. So this is kind of an internal project across the Wildlife Trusts, but we're very happy to talk about it externally. And it's evolved in response to that evidence crisis. We recognise that across the sector, we have gaps in our evidence base. We have a lack of evidence-based decision-making, not as much as we should. And when we polled wildlife trusts, 80% of wildlife trusts said evidence is vital to our work. Personally, I'm sort of surprised it wasn't 100%, but anyway. But sadly, only 35% of us felt our wildlife trusts were truly evidence-led. So there's a lot of work to do to get to where we really want to get to. And many of us, might find it surprising because we collect a huge amount of evidence on land and sea. Take things like the Sea Search program that we're involved in and so on. It's a huge amount of evidence we collect. But when we go to the next step and ask ourselves, are we really using that evidence all the time to drive decision-making? That's where it falls down a bit more. Is it the coming together and driving the big data sets that we need to know what's going on? So now we have, with this Evidence Emergency Project, we are making sure that we're trying to embed evidence-based conservation at the core of every single wildlife trust across the country. And so far, there are some outputs that we've done that really start to shape this new approach. In 2024, we did a thorough survey and look at the research and evidence around reducing greenhouse gas emissions, particularly from our conservation grazing. These are all available on our website if you want to find them. We've also been having a much more focused and rigorous approach in looking at the evidence around the benefits for natural flood management. We're also celebrating the work of individual trusts, say in this case Dorset Wildlife Trusts, about the monitoring and evidence they're collecting, say around nature-friendly farming in this case. And you'll find many of these and others in our Wild Science report from 2024, again, which you can find online. And we've got a new one of these coming out in the next year, I think. And we've also created a centre of excellence on our own sort of equivalent of the intranet, what we call WildNet, which has, for people across the Wildlife Trust, plenty of case studies of projects using evidence really well. The tools, the standard tools we've now got across the Wildlife Trust to collect evidence more efficiently, and also understanding from others which projects have been tried, what works, what doesn't, what are we learning. And we also invited trusts to nominate evidence advocates, and delighted to say that we now have over 40 evidence advocates across the Wildlife Trusts from 23 trusts and so on, as people that are there seeing themselves as change makers to build a culture of evidence-based conservation in each and every wildlife trusts across the country. And of course, this becomes a community of practice to shape and champion this cultural shift. We've also got Evidence Centre of Excellence, a virtual hub, as I said, on our intranet, and staff in the central team that are shaping this as well. But I want to emphasise what's absolutely key in this. It's not just so much the tools, it's not just so much the data and the practices and so on. Perhaps the biggest thing that you need to shift in any organisation around this is culture and practice, and learning from each other, shaping behaviours, and what becomes norm, asking the right kind of questions at the right times to make sure that we become a truly evidence-led organisation, an organisation that's constantly championing the role of evidence. And we think very simply that by embedding evidence into everyday practice, the Wildlife Trust can make, yes, better conservation decisions, that's hugely important. But if we then go back to what I was saying before about the politics, we need to use the evidence to tell more compelling stories. So it doesn't just stop at the evidence. We need that to make more compelling stories, and then we'll have greater impact for wildlife. And one final thought is when we get this right, as we did around some of the work we've done around our temperate rainforest project over the last few years, we were able to have real solid evidence there about the work we could do to try and restore temperate rainforests up the west coast of the British Isles. Really solid evidence about how we'd be able to demonstrate how we can monitor the change we can do on that. And that's actually enabled us to secure £40 million from Aviva to restore temperate rainforests up the west coast of the British Isles. So it gives you a sense of just what's possible. We would say we've only just started on this transformation on this. It will take 5 years before we're really there, but the difference we could make could be huge. Thank you very much.